Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Saga of the Swamp Thing, Book 4. Now, this is Volume 4 of Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing. Now, Alan Moore did not originally create this series, or this character. The character of Swamp Thing was originally created by Wein and Bernie Wrightson, and the series started in the 1970s, but in 1984, Alan Moore took over this series, and his run lasted until 1987, and during that time, he reinvented this series and this character so much that you could almost consider his Swamp Thing comics to be their own separate series. Now, these comics were originally published by DC, but now all the issues of Alan Moore's Swamp Thing series have been put together into a 6-volume graphic novel series published by Vertigo. Now, I have reviewed the first 3 volumes of this series, and I'll leave links in the description below to where you can check out those videos. Now, one of the things that Alan Moore did with his Swamp Thing comics was he reinvented Swamp Thing's origin. Now, in the older Swamp Thing comics, Swamp Thing was a scientist named Alec Holland who was working on this formula that could make plants grow in the desert, and his lab was bombed and he was exposed to his own chemical and transformed into a half-human, half-plant-like creature. But in Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, you find out that Alec Holland actually died in that explosion, and Swamp Thing is just a plant creature that inherited Alec Holland's memories, so a big part of the character's arc throughout this series is him coming to grips with the fact that he was never human, yet still maintaining his humanity, and also trying to figure out what exactly he is. And Alan Moore, he really gave this character a lot of pathos, and throughout this series he would touch on a lot of deeper political and social themes like racism, sexism, intolerance, and environmental issues. He would also touch on a lot of philosophical themes like the nature of good and evil, what does it mean to be human, and the existence of God, and you wouldn't think something called Swamp Thing would touch on these themes. And in this, he would really combine the superhero genre with the horror genre, because this is set in the DC universe, and familiar DC characters do show up in this, but it's a horror story first and foremost. Now, Book 4 collects the rest of the issues in the American Gothic story arc. The first few issues of this arc were collected in Book 3. Now, the premise of the American Gothic story arc is Swamp Thing and Abby meet this mysterious man named John Constantine, who you find out later on is sort of a modern-day wizard/exorcist. And he knows more about Swamp Thing than Swamp Thing knows himself, so in exchange for information, Constantine sends Swamp Thing on these different assignments to different parts of America to take care of a certain supernatural threat. And a lot of the issues of the American Gothic series kind of worked as their own standalone stories, but there was an overarching continuity. And each issue of the American Gothic story arc dealt with a different social issue going on in America, but it used monsters or something supernatural to reflect that issue. Now, the character of John Constantine from these comics would later be spun off into his own comic book series called Hellblazer, which were the same comics that were the basis for the 2005 film Constantine with Keanu Reeves. And as I said, Volume 4 finishes off the American Gothic story arc, and it begins with several self-contained stories, but eventually they start bleeding together and form a singular narrative when you realize that all of this was leading up to something. Now, the issues collected in this volume are Windfall, Boogeymen, Ghost Dance, Revelations, The Pollerman of Trees, A Murder of Crows, The Summoning, and The End. And as I said, the first few issues kind of work as standalone stories. So the first story in here is called Windfall, an absolutely beautiful, beautiful story that you don't even have to know who Swamp Thing is in order to enjoy this story, because Swamp Thing only makes one actual appearance in the beginning. Now, it was established earlier on in the series that Swamp Thing sometimes has these tubers growing off his body that resemble yams. And in the story, this guy named Chester finds one of these while wandering around through the swamp. And while studying it, he determines that it has hallucinogenic properties, and this friend of his comes over asking for some kind of drugs because this friend of his wife is dying of cancer, and he's trying to get something to give his wife to ease her of her pain. So Chester gives this friend of his a piece of this yam to give to his wife, and when his wife takes it, she basically starts tripping out, but not in a bad way. Like, it takes her pain away, and it gets her to accept what's going to happen to her. And the whole story is really about accepting death, and accepting that it's just part of the cycle of life. And the story is also really about this guy saying goodbye to his wife. But while all that is happening, there was this douchebag who was harassing Chester to give him some drugs, and Chester gave him a part of this yam, and when this guy takes it, he starts hallucinating that he is Swamp Thing. And basically you find out that the hallucinogenic properties of these tubers affects you based on your personality. But again, it's a beautiful story. After that, we get a story called Boogeymen, and this one is about a serial killer who legitimately thinks he's the boogeyman himself, and he's wandering through Swamp Thing's swamp after killing a guy, and then he runs into the Swamp Thing. And what's really interesting about this story is, throughout this whole series, you saw Swamp Thing battling different monsters like demons and vampires and ghosts and zombies, and Swamp Thing himself is a monster, but now he's confronted by arguably the worst kind of monster, a serial killer. Now, the serial killer from this story was mentioned in passing in the second volume of Neil Gaiman's Sandman series, The Doll's House. Also, Batman makes a brief appearance in this issue. Also, something that I thought was cool because I'm a big Clive Barker fan, there's a part of this issue where Abby is reading a copy of Clive Barker's The Books of Blood. It's funny, I remember listening to an interview with Stephen Passett, who did the artwork for most of these comics. He said that when that book came out, Alan Moore called him up saying, "You have to read this." Now, that would be something if Alan Moore and Clive Barker worked on a project together, but I'm pretty sure the universe would implode from the sheer awesomeness of that. After that, you get a story called Ghost Dance, which you also really don't have to be familiar with Swamp Thing in order to get this story, because it really does work as a standalone horror story, and Swamp Thing and Constantine don't even show up till the end of this. But this one is very much based on the Winchester House. They don't call it the Winchester House in the story, they call it the Cambridge House, but it's clearly based on the Winchester House if you're familiar with that. But basically the story is about a house in California that was built by the widow of a rifle manufacturer who felt guilty about all the people that were killed by her husband's rifles. And she built the house for the ghost of the people killed by the guns that her husband's company manufactured. And the story follows two couples who are messing around at the house, and they discover that the legends of the house are true. And Swamp Thing shows up at the end to try to put a stop to this haunting. Now, a lot of these stories in the American Gothic series have social commentary in them, and the commentary that Alan Moore is making in this story is definitely about gun violence in America. And the story is also satirizing America's obsession with guns. And the story also has a really darkly ironic ending. Then we come to an issue called Revelations, which kind of works as a standalone story, but this is where the serialization really starts to happen. This is where you find out that all of these seemingly self-contained stories that we have been reading in this series up until this point were leading to something. And this is where all the issues start to bleed together into a singular narrative. This issue also ties directly in with the Crisis on Infinite Earths story arc. Now, Crisis on Infinite Earths was a 12-issue comic book series done by Marv Wolfman, and because the majority of what DC puts out is arguably in the same continuity, even though I'll be honest, I have a tendency to pick and choose what's canon. But basically every comic that DC was putting out at the time had to do at least one issue tying in with the Crisis storyline. Now, I haven't read Crisis on Infinite Earths yet, but I'm planning to, so I might be oversimplifying this, but I know it was a major event that happened in the DC universe. But basically, in that storyline, there was a multiverse. There were all these different parallel universes, but there was some kind of cosmic event happening that was causing these parallel universes to merge together into one. And time and reality was becoming altered. And again, this issue ties in with that, and my biggest worry going into this was, because Crisis on Infinite Earths was what DC used to essentially reset their continuity, my biggest worry was that it was going to make everything we read in this series up until that point worthless. But luckily that doesn't seem to be the case. It seems like everything we saw this character go through up until this point still happened to this character even post-Crisis. And Alan Moore, I think, very cleverly works the whole Crisis event into what he was already planning. In this issue, you find out about a cult in South America who have apparently existed for millions of years, so they predate man, so obviously the original members of this cult weren't even humans. And this cult practices black magic, and it turns out that they're responsible for all these supernatural things that Swamp Thing has been dealing with up until this point. And it turns out that they knew this cosmic crisis was going to happen, and they have been anticipating it for centuries because of how it was going to affect the spiritual world. It turns out that there's this darkness that existed before God created the universe, and this cult wants to bring this darkness back, which will destroy heaven. After that, you get an issue called Pollerman of Trees, which technically works as a standalone story, but it kind of does tie in with everything else that is going on. But basically in this issue, Swamp Thing finally learns what he is, and he meets other creatures of his kind. It turns out that Swamp Thing is an elemental, and he comes to what is basically a graveyard for other elementals, where it turns out that when their time is up, they become rooted to the ground. But really, the rest of the book from then on is really about Swamp Thing and Constantine, and some of Constantine's allies going down to South America to try to stop this cult. And ultimately, the story leads to Swamp Thing entering the astral plane, and him, Deadman, Dr. Fate, the Phantom Stranger, Edrican the Demon, and the Spectre now have to defend heaven from this evil god. And because Hell is also in danger, Heaven and Hell have to actually team up to take on this dark god. Meanwhile, Constantine and several other magicians and psychics are doing their part from Earth. But this entire volume is freaking awesome, and it's a great mix between horror, drama, science fiction, and even theistic fantasy. This also touches on a lot of really interesting philosophical themes, especially in the final issue that's collected in this volume called The End, which ends off the whole American Gothic story arc. In that issue, it touches on a lot of interesting themes about really the nature of good and evil, and what is evil. Like, there are certain points where some characters get swallowed up by this dark god, and it doesn't kill them, but it asks them what is evil, and they each give their own definition of what evil is, and you get this real sense that this thing is only evil because they're saying it's evil. Like, it's still dangerous and it still needs to be stopped, but you get a real sense that this thing is just acting according to its nature. And the characters in the story are really just projecting their own views on evil onto this thing. And the story also brings up a really good point that if you believe in God and you believe that God created reality as we know it, that means God also created darkness. And you get this real sense that good and evil really can't exist without each other. So the story is touching on a lot of really sophisticated themes, and keep in mind, this was published at a time when comic books were really just thought of as nothing but children's fare. And with this run on Swamp Thing, Alan Moore was really showing that comic books can be for adults as well, and they can be political and philosophical and touch on really adult themes. Now, in the final issue collected in this volume, the characters of Cain and Abel show up. Cain and Abel were originally the hosts of DC's horror anthology series like House of Mystery and House of Secrets. Neil Gaiman would eventually make Cain and Abel reoccurring characters in his Sandman series, which is very much in continuity with this. Now, I don't want to give too much away, but something pretty major happens to Abby during the events of this volume, and that leads into the events of Volume 5 of this series, which I haven't read yet, but I believe it mostly takes place in Gotham City, and I know Batman does show up in that. Now, depending on how big Batman's role is in that story arc, I might actually save that review for when I do my series of Batman reviews, which is something I do every January. But yeah, that was my review on Saga of the Swamp Thing, Book 4 by Alan Moore. Now, before I end this video, I want to cut to a short review that my friend Christian Feliciano did on this book.
Whenever I talk about Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing, I always bring up the genre of fantasy. And for the first 3 volumes, you can't really see fantasy, you more see horror and science fiction and superhero stuff, stuff like that. But when it comes to the fantasy stuff, what I really mean is what happens in Volume 4 especially. Because when you look at Volume 4, it really does feel like a Dungeons and Dragons type of a fantasy story. You have a bunch of mages who are protecting heaven from this great destruction without any spoilers. And just the fact that there's a whole bunch of magicians and you have ghosts and you have zombies and all these things, it really does feel like a fantasy story. It feels like Game of Thrones, it feels like Dungeons and Dragons, it feels like Lord of the Rings type of thing. Even though it is still Swamp Thing and it still is DC and it still is a superhero story, don't get me wrong, it's just that when you see that there's a bunch of magic and all this stuff going on, you really do get the fantasy aspect of it. And it's great to see that. I love this book. Volume 4 of Alan Moore's Swamp Thing is just as good as all the other volumes. I think my favorite volume of all time is number 3 because that's the introduction to Constantine and all that stuff. But Constantine shows up in this, and he's very prevalent in the storylines in this book. And of course you also have Etrigan the Demon, you have the Phantom Stranger, you also have Deadman, characters that I love to death and you don't really see them often enough in the DC Universe. But Alan Moore was able to take these characters and make them amazing in ways that they had never been done before. I mean, he really took them and made them serious and he made them relevant and he made them not corny basically, because Deadman, especially Deadman, he was a trapeze artist who, he gets killed and then he comes back as a ghost and they call him Deadman, you get it, Deadman. But, and before that concept was really corny, but Alan Moore takes that and makes it very serious. The same thing with the Phantom Stranger, he takes Etrigan the Demon, who wasn't really corny, it's just that, I guess, after Jack Kirby, he really wasn't used the way he should have been, and Alan Moore is one of the only people I feel who have done Etrigan the Demon justice. You know, they given the guy justice. And I love this book to death. Alan Moore is a fantastic writer. I highly recommend you read the first volumes before you read this one, just so you can understand what's going on. But that's not really a problem. It's not like you're going to have to push your way through the other books. No, because the other ones are very, very, very entertaining. I'm just saying, just to understand it, you should read the other ones first and then read this one, and you'll enjoy this one just the same. I love this book. Highly recommend it. Definitely check it out. And that's my review. Thank you, and bye.